often in the Bible, God's described as patient, slow to anger, and he's dealing in a way so that people have time to come to him. But then there's these moments, like Genesis 6.
Decreation moments.
And here in Exodus with the 10th plague, where it's just like...
Same with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. Because it's those decreation moments that are exactly the parts of the biblical melody that usually for us as modern readers, we're just like, I'm super uncomfortable with what God's doing right now.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay to feel that. However, I don't want to have that blind me from also the important point being made that there are times when human evil gets so woven and so large scale that it sows the seeds of its own ruin that creates immense suffering and pain and injustice in the world. And bringing that ship down, burning, is just a big moral mess.
Yeah.
And that is reflected, I think, in the moral tensions that are raised in these stories. And I've come here now, whenever I'm brought here at this point in the biblical melody of the cycles, it's good for me. But I can tell it's going to be something that's resolved, if ever, this side of my resurrection, just by lots of years of prayer and pondering and taking it to God in prayer. Because logically, I keep hitting roadblocks when it comes to this. And that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the journey, at least for me. So this is actually previewing the whole cycle of conflict that's going to go down between Israel and Pharaoh all the way up to Passover, which is where God puts a choice in front of everyone in the land of Egypt, which is there's going to be a destroyer that goes through the land that night, and the life of the firstborn is at risk. So in Passover, what God is showing is to have ultimate responsibility and authority over the most powerful imperial rulers of the land and their family monarchies. But it says from the firstborn of every animal to the peasant in their home to Pharaoh on his throne.
Yeah.
And all of those firstborns belong to Yahweh. And so he can give them their life or take away their life. And those are the stakes of Passover. And so God's obviously reversing and bringing back on Pharaoh what he brought on Israel, which is to take the life of their sons. But here at Passover, Yahweh provides what Pharaoh never did, which is a choice. You have a choice of how things go. Yahweh will protect the life of the firstborn if you choose to come under the covering of the substitute that Yahweh provides. And that's the Passover lamb and the blood on the doorpost. But if you refuse to accept Yahweh's gift of covering, then you forfeit the life of your firstborn. That's how the logic of Passover works. And I'm describing it clinically right now, which masks over a disturbance in my inner force. Disturbance. The plague of the Passover and of the taking of the firstborn, as long as I've sat with it and worked through it, can understand how it works in the story, it's hard for me.
Yeah.
It's hard for me.
Is it harder than the flood for you?
Same type of difficulty. Yeah. Or with the rebellion of the sons of Korah, where the whole family suffers for the sins of their father. And essentially, that's exactly it. It's that of children being held accountable for the sins of their fathers, which is Ezekiel says in Ezekiel 18, that's exactly how Yahweh does not operate. That's what Ezekiel says. In Ezekiel, God says, I don't hold children accountable for the sins of their fathers. But yet that's precisely the logic underneath the Passover narrative. I spent my summer trying to read deeply in a number of early Greek church fathers and scholars. I learned a lot over the summer. It was wonderful. One was a theologian and a pastor named Gregory of Nyssa. And he has this wonderful short treatment called The Life of Moses. And it's an interpretation of the Moses story. And when he gets to Passover, he just straight up names it. He just says, what do we do with this portrait of God? holding innocent children. And he really turns up the volume. He's like, what has a babe done? It has cried only for the nipple of its mother and basked in its parents' arms. And what has it done that it deserves death for the sins of Pharaoh? I mean, he names it straight up. He names the tension. And he has his own way of resolving it that I'm still processing through. But so this is an element about the portrait of God in the Hebrew Bible. This is one of those portraits that is hard. If you take as your starting point the character of God revealed in Jesus, because it seems to me the character of God revealed in Jesus wouldn't do something like this.
Well, and so we're bringing it up, though, because
it's about the firstborn.
It's about the firstborn.
Yeah.
And so what's bothering us is that God would hold a child responsible for the actions of their parents. An infant, even.
Yeah, totally. It's not like
it's not like a 16-year-old boy who's
the
like
most vulnerable
alliance.
and innocent. Yeah, the one who has done no good or evil. And actually,
Everyone.
let me just add one more layer, because for me, this is the thing where my mind goes as to some kind of resolution, is in Egyptian religion and culture, Pharaoh is God. Pharaoh is the incarnation of their most powerful deity. And
different than being the image of God in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
Like he is the incarnation of God.
That's right. And so it's not insignificant that in Exodus 12, check this out. This is within the instructions about Passover. Yahweh says in Exodus 12:12, I will go through the land that night, the night of Passover. I will strike down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and animal, and against all of the Elohim of Egypt, I will bring my justice. I am Yahweh. So somehow Passover is a strike against the Elohim of Egypt also, which seems odd to us. It's like, well, okay, the humans and the animals and then the Elohim, but they're all one in this narrative. Taking
down the firstborn of Egypt is taking down the Elohim in some way.
Yes, that's what Exodus 12:12 clearly implies.
Yeah, that there's a spiritual rebellion that is getting intertwined in the power structure of this human empire.
Yes.
And by God dealing with the power structure of that human empire is actually dealing with the spiritual evil.
Yes, just like in the flood. In other words,
same dynamic as in the flood.
Exactly. It's about this illicit, mutant merging of Elohim and human to create monstrous human violence and evil in the world. And that's precisely what is happening in that strange son about the sons of Elohim and the daughters of Adam in Genesis 6:1-4. That's like the last part of the rebellion that leads to the flood. In other words, this is the melody replaying. So within the Exodus narrative, God striking the firstborn of Egypt is God striking at the human divine rebellion that is combined in Egypt. I think that's how the logic of the story works. And so these are moments, back to the flood narrative, God accelerates a process that humans have already begun in building a culture that's become so monstrous in its neglect of human life and value, it's reached the point of no return. And that's these flood-like decreation moments. And this is why the 10 plagues are riddled with vocabulary from the flood narrative. It's uncanny.
Yeah.
In other words, the words used to describe the waters of the flood and what they do and what happens, it's all the same vocabulary used over and over again throughout the plagues.
So we could go to Exodus 12, which I usually do, where at the Passover, when the death angel, the destroyer, is coming, God says, "This night I will have victory over the gods of Egypt." It wasn't just that night. It was the whole thing. Okay, on their gods the Lord executed judgments, plural. All the plagues have something to do with this. So let's get into a few of them. You have the Nile turned to blood. in Exodus 7. I'm not going to go out to all the passages. A lot of these are going to be familiar to you. Why would that be a big deal? Who's supposed to maintain the correct working of the Nile? Who's supposed to maintain Ma'at? Pharaoh. Horus incarnate. So God, through Moses, turns the Nile into blood. Now we know that the Egyptian priests, they can't fix this, but they can mimic it. Frogs are next. This is an attack on the goddess Hechet, responsible for the control, specifically, of multiplication of the frogs in the Nile. You had too many frogs, it was a problem. The gnats and the flies. Now Herodotus makes an interesting comment about Egyptian priests that factors into the gnats and the flies plague. He says Egyptian priests shave the whole body every other day, that no lice or aught else or anything else that is foul may infest them in their service of their gods. Why? Are they just clean freaks? No. They do it so that they are able to go in to the temples all across the land and do their daily priestly function. So if everybody's plagued with gnats and flies, and again, one of those terms you could translate as lice, we've got a big problem if we're Egypt. Our priests can't maintain order. They can't feed the gods their daily offerings. They can't open the doors of the temples to show that the presence of the deity is there in the object, illuminating the temple and the land. The gods are shut down. They're out of business if they don't have the priests. And so by extension, this is crippling the worship of the false gods of Egypt. We've had a fall in Genesis 3. We've had a second rebellion in Genesis 6 that was so bad, that permeated humanity so deeply that God sends a flood. After the flood, Noah and his sons emerge from the ark, and God says to them, okay, we're going to try again. God repeats the original Edenic mandate to go forth, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. There's a reference in Genesis 9 to humanity still bearing the image of God. You're still my imagers. I want you to go out and do the original job of Eden. We're going to start over again. So do that. Spread out, populate, and spread my goodness, the knowledge of me throughout the world, and this is what I want done. So what do? They congregate at Babel. And at this point, God has had enough. This is why I refer to the Tower of Babel as the Romans 1 event of the Old Testament. If you read Romans 1, it talks about God giving humanity up to their sin. Just, okay, this is the way you want to live, have at it. We'll see how that goes. God has had enough at Babel. He divorces humanity. He disinherits them from being in his family. He cuts them off. He abandons them. He's angry. Now, we know it's not permanent because what he does next tells us that. God divorces humanity and says, okay, you don't want me to be your God. I'm still interested in you because you are my imagers. So I'm going to allot you. This is the language of Deuteronomy 4. Okay, this is a whole system of theology. What happens at Babel is God says, look, I'm done. I am done with you people. But you're still my imagers, and so I'm going to assign you to lesser Elohim of my counsel, and I'm going to assign them to you. Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32, it's two sides of the same coin. And what I want is they're going to be sort of placeholders. I want them to rule you, nations, even though it's not going to be me. I'm out of the picture here. You're getting stepdads now, stepgods. But I still want you people to be ruled according to my good character, my justice, my righteousness. You say, well, that wasn't in any of those verses. You're correct, it wasn't. But if you go to Psalm 82, where these gods are being judged by God in a divine council meeting, and God is really angry there, he actually sentences these other gods to death. I said, verse 6, Psalm 82:6, I said to all of you, you are Elohim, all of you. The pronoun's plural too. You're all Elohim, you're all sons of the Most High, but you're going to die like men. Why are they being judged? Verses 2 through 5. For injustice, corruption, for sowing chaos in their nations. And also, if you go back to Deuteronomy 32, they accept worship. They encourage idolatry, which was a problem that began with Genesis 6. Okay, we're back there again. So they do a miserable job, and this is a judgment. This is a judgment against the world, against humanity. God, wants these people still governed well, because when he calls Abraham and makes Israel his own inheritance, when he makes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12, what does he say to Abraham? It's through your seed that all of these nations are ultimately going to be blessed. God still has the nations on his brain, as it were. But right now, his relationship is with Israel. It will be through Israel that the Messiah is raised up, that will bring all of this full circle and bring the nations back into the fold. This is why we have Paul. Okay, this is why we have an apostle to the Gentiles. So Israel, this is why Israel has to be set off and set apart. They are to be a conduit of blessing and an example of blessing to the other nations. Ultimately, what's going to accelerate that is the coming of the Messiah, God as man. But in the Old Testament, what this does is creates a worldview circumstance, and this is it. Right after Babel and the call of Abraham, that sets the stage for the rest of the Old Testament. This is why it's Israel against the nations, and the nations against Israel. And it's why it's Yahweh against the gods, and the gods against Yahweh.
And part of the plague of the firstborn is kind of a way of God saying, look, I'm attacking the very center and heart of your misunderstanding of power.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it's good.
And not only am I going to attack it, but I'm going to give you a way out, which is to align with a new type of power, which is saying, you see this immigrant population that you think you can just abuse?
Yeah.
Like
that's my firstborn.
That's my firstborn.
Yeah.
And in my economy, it works completely different.
Yep.
You can get on board with that economy,
Yeah.
and you actually will find power and blessing.
You'll get the blessing too.
Or you can just run with the way you want to do it, which is giving it to your firstborn. And actually, I'm going to just disrupt that at its source. I'm just going to stop it.
That's right.
In a pretty violent and disturbing way, which feels just as violent and disturbing as God saying, I'm just going to stop human violence on the earth in Genesis 6.
That's right.
And so you're saying there's something happening here where the volume's turned up, where often in the Bible, God's described as patient, slow to anger, and he's dealing in a way so that people have time to come to him. But then there's these moments, like Genesis 6.
Decreation moments.
And here in Exodus with the 10th plague, where it's just like...
Same with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm stopping it.